I call this meeting of the Board of Internal Economy to order, and I want to welcome Mr. Julian back to the Board of Internal Economy. First time in this building.
Yes, yeah.
The first thing we have, of course, is the minutes of the previous meeting. Are those approved? Mr. Strahl.
Just one, I would flag for the table there, perhaps. I would like to get perhaps a briefing for staff or ourselves, not necessarily at the table here, but just an idea of what the governance structure, what it looks like for the center block. I know Mr. Patrice appeared at PROC and indicated that process was underway. So perhaps if we could just make a note of that we could get kind of more details on what that looks like and how we want to proceed with that. I'd appreciate that.
Duly noted, and we'll do. I'm told we'll do.
Yes.
Okay, good. Business arising, so that minutes are approved otherwise? Approved, okay. Business arising from the previous meeting? Not seeing any. We're on to modernization of policies related to communicating with constituents. First of all, lors de la rencontre du bureau.
During the meeting on the 28th of February last, changes to the 10 percenters program were presented for approval, and board members discussed a limit on the number of householders that can be sent under the newly proposed program.
6 times the number of households in a member's constituency per calendar year, and it was agreed that further examination of this limit was required. It's my understanding that since the last meeting, a revised proposal to establish the limit at 8 times the number of households in a member's constituency per calendar year has been put forward and is supported. If this is indeed the case, the administration will monitor volumes and financial forecasts and return to the board for direction in any given year if required. Is it the will of the board to approve this revised proposal? I think I'm saying yes, so that's agreed. So we can now go on, I think, to Mr. Giroux and Mr. Pac. No? Oh, so that finishes number 3. You guys are really good there.
No.
Mr. Strahl.
Yes. If we could just have some clarification, I have the package of the different 10 percenters or the different constituency mailers that are now available. Could you just describe, obviously, there's the 30-day rule now comes into effect, which we're used to having with our householder package. Could you maybe just, for members who I'm sure will be watching and reading this transcript later, what the difference is between now, what are the differences between a constituency mailer and a householder, and whether the 30-day exclusionary period will apply just for those certain types of mail? Could you do 2 householders in 30 days apart, and a constituency mailer in between that, or is there a coordination of those printed pieces, or are they on separate tracks?
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. Indeed, they're on separate tracks. They're 2 different programs, and they will remain as 2 different programs. The main difference is a householder. You use 1 year of your allocation of a householder, and you can cover your full riding. If you decide to do less in a householder, then it's your allocation. Right. And you use your allocation even if you do less. For constituency mailings, you can break it out. Like you can decide, let's say you have a riding of 50,000. You can decide to send 5,000 in a given area of a riding. The next day, 10,000 somewhere else, and so on, up to your full household, and that resets every 30 days. So you can indeed do 1 householder and a full constituency mail at the same time, because the counter is for each program and not dependent on each other.
Thank you.
Okay, merci beaucoup. Rien d'autre? Nothing else? Merci, monsieur. We'll go on to number 4. Number 4, transition support resettlement provisions for members not re-elected and not seeking re-election. présentateurs sont M. Paquette.
So presenters are Mr. Paquette and Mr. Parent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm accompanied by Robin Degg, Director of Members HR Services, and the purposes of the current submission is to ask your permission to modernize the current resettlement provisions. The purpose is to facilitate access those who are not elected or candidates to have support services. Provisions on resettlement now provides for advice on retirement, finances, reclassification, retraining, and it also covers certain amounts of travel. The changes being proposed take into account comments that were given by members who have left politics and who are members of former parliamentarians' associations. They said that the way these policies are being applied do not correspond to their needs after political life. So the changes being provided would allow for support and would also reduce the administrative burden on MPs while giving them some flexibility. So we're suggesting the following. Extend access to the employee assistance program, so from 6 to 12 months for former MPs and staff who have been let go. There would also be proactive actions being taken during resettlement by providing more information on the employee assistance program. And I'm going to give the floor now to Robin.
Services through a third-party outplacement company contracted by the House Administration. Members will be able to choose one of several standard transition packages. Members will also be able to use alternative career transition service firms by submitting a request with justification to the Chief HR Officer for consideration. We also propose to remove the provision for expenses related to secretarial services, as these types of temporary help services will be offered through the third-party provider being proposed. Increase flexibility for departing members who wish to receive alternative forms of education and training by allowing the Chief HR Officer to review, assess, and approve where warranted education or training that does not meet the usual training parameters. For example, training that is not necessarily offered by a recognized institution in Canada. Maintain the availability of travel options currently used by departing members while specifying the purpose of travel and providing supporting documentation as with existing members. Provide increased flexibility to members by extending the start, completion, and claim submission dates for transition-related activities. And finally, clarify what expenses are included in the $15,000 transition support amount. If these changes and improvements are accepted, they will be communicated to members through the transition support process. We are happy to answer any questions at this time.
Madam Chager. Madam Berger, Bergen, what am I saying? Bergen, thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. That's okay.
Looked at her and said,
That's all right. People get us mixed up all the time. Thank you for this. I think it's really good that you're looking at this. I know I've heard from members of Parliament, especially those who lost, whereby obviously they were not expecting it. It's a terrible blow to members of Parliament, and I mean I'm hearing the impact that it has. It really is hard on individuals, and you know, in the spirit of we're all team players here. I know there's going to be a lot of Liberals going through this after the next election, so I just kind of joking there, but anyway, seriously, two things I'm wondering. I know I'd heard some discussion around one of the problems previously was when an individual is defeated, their emails and their contacts get cut off very, very quickly. And that's for a lot of MPs. I mean, their phone is their life. So I wonder if there's some thought around that and how they could be helped in getting that important information. And I'm also wondering, I know you mentioned that you had talked with the former parliamentarians, but I think they're actually doing some work. Dorothy Dobie, I think, is the new head of it, and she's been doing some work on this, some practical things that could help parliamentarians who are leaving, but not because they want to be leaving. So I wondered if we could maybe even there might be a few more practical things that could be added that would help individuals. And I even wonder, though, kind of the whole counseling part of it. Like, people go through a really, really hard time when they lose an election. Imagine losing your job, getting fired, but you're fired basically by your entire riding, and your whole life has been serving these people, and there's just a lot wrapped up in it. I wonder if there may be some discussion or will to even help former MPs who have lost their riding to transition back, some counseling. Thank you.
Well, I know we've been in discussion with the Association of Former Parliamentarians, so we'll continue discussions. And we spoke with several members that were in contact with members that were defeated, especially, and you're right, members who were defeated, we've been told that it is a shock, and that's why, for instance, the 6 months to 12 months for the Employee Assistance Program, because we've been told the first 6 months there is a shock to absorb, and then they're ready to look at the future. I can't comment specifically on the email, so I don't know. We can come back to you, but that's something that we'll consider.
We'll look at that, and I can assure you that it was such a shock to me that I still call it my involuntary sabbatical, and not my loss. You see, okay, Mr. Holland.
I too, Mr. Speaker, enjoyed an involuntary sabbatical. And can speak with some experience on this, and I agree absolutely that it is an incredible shock for people who go through it, because it consumes all of your life. It becomes more than a job. It becomes almost your identity. So it becomes a very trying experience, and so I think the extension from 6 months to a year is very important for the Employee Assistance Program, because of the fact that the first 6 months people are often just still absorbing what happened. It can take some time to do that, and so I think ensuring that people are in a good mental state is incredibly important. I agree as well on the point of contacts, and I'm wondering if, because the cell phones that are allocated come from a central bank, so when you arrive here, you have to give up your cell phone number and get a cell phone number. For people who are trying to establish themselves thereafter, to lose that phone number is particularly challenging them for those individuals making a transition. So I wonder, I can understand when you're coming in that you're trying to guard a certain number, but if there's a way of releasing those numbers on the other side so that members can maintain that same contact. Similarly, I can understand we don't want people advertising that they have a parl.gc.ca email address, but there should be a way that when emails go there, because they're effectively dead, that the server can reroute them, so that in other words, that email can, for at least a period of time, reroute that email traffic coming through their P9. And only their P9, I would suggest, but because that's limited in personal traffic, to reroute it in a particular way, because I think that's a very key point. I think after 2 or 3 weeks, suddenly all of your contact information is gone, and it becomes hard for people to maintain contact.
Okay, I see my colleague, the Chief Information Officer, taking notes, so I'm sure this can be addressed.
Julian.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's quite a pleasure to be back here today.
I think everyone would understand that the intensity of the job means that the transition is particularly difficult for somebody who's defeated. They're going basically seven days out of 7, 16-hour days. They get through the election, and then they have to wrap up their constituency office. If they've lost, they have to wrap up their Ottawa office. They're basically putting years of their life in boxes, and if it's somebody from British Columbia, that means having to move right across the country. And then after all of that is done, that intense period of another month, then they finally have a chance to concentrate on themselves. And for anybody, it's intense losing the job. For anybody, it's a particularly difficult time of their life. So I would agree with Ms. Bergen and Mr. Holland about the communications aspect, that for them also to be cut off from their friends, their contacts, the people they've worked with is difficult. And so having provisions for that communications continuing on would be important. And the counseling is important too. And I gather from Ms. Bergen's question that the counseling isn't necessarily a big part of what is provided in the assistant packages. So if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit more on the employment assistance plan, what for the employee assistance plan, what that means in terms of, let's say, the following year for that individual. What would they have access to? What would they not have access to in terms of mental health supports? Because for all of us who've been here, we know colleagues that have taken it very hard. They need those supports. In many cases, sadly, it means that maybe previous things that they thought they'd conquered come back. So having that counseling in place can make a real difference for that person to be able to get back on their feet again.
Thank you for the question. I think one of the pieces, too, to highlight in the submission is around the more proactive approach with the EAP program. Right now, it's been more positioned as this is available to you. There's a couple of things that we're going to be doing to position that service more appropriately. So in the transition centers, there will be EAP counselors on site to meet with members who may want to avail of them at that time. They might not be ready, so we recognize that, but we at least want to have that in place. And then we'll be doing outreach to the MPs within that 12-month period to let them know what's available through the EAP, and also to highlight the career transition service packages that are available to them, because in there they may it might not necessarily be the personal counseling, but there might be other pieces that they can focus on. Through the EAP, there's a variety of services available. One of them can be access to counseling. Some of them can be around mental health, financial pieces as well, and that's also in supplement to the career transition service.
Mr. Strahl.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad we are having this discussion. I've spoke to many colleagues who were not reelected in 2015 who said their plan A was to win and plan B was also to win. And when that didn't happen, there really is a period of scrambling around trying to get your feet under you. And it's different for different people. Some people are right back at, they might have an opportunity to get back into their trade or profession, but for others, that's not the case. I would encourage, I think part of the issue is, as Mr. Julian has indicated, when there is an unexpected career transition given to you by your neighbors and community, I think there is an overwhelming amount of work that has to take place. And so getting this package sent to you after you have just suffered a soul-crushing defeat is perhaps not the best time to get that information into the hands of members. I would suggest that it be sent out to all members prior to the dissolution of this Parliament, and that the package be listed in a way. Some people might laugh it off, I'll never need that, but at least it would be there for their consideration, and they might have looked at, okay, they might be looking at it when they're in a better state of mind than after an election. So if that's possible, to kind of package this up and send it out. I know there will be a board notice that will come out, but maybe a more comprehensive package. The second thing I would say is, while it's good, we're having these discussions right now, there is also, at the same time this is happening, a mad dash to get the dozens, if not hundreds, of new members of Parliament into their place, and they are just as eager to get here and in settled as the people who are getting punted are wanting to kind of have the last moment there. I know there was some in the last Parliament where it was literally down to the last hour, like, we are going to kick you out of your office now. And I think that really, so I guess my thought would be that I'm hoping there is two different teams, that it's not the same, the team that's transitioning people out is not the same team that is transitioning people in, and that the people that are transitioning out have a specific point of contact, and they know that everyone knows the rules of the game and the time frames and everything, and there's not that pressure point where the same group is perhaps, I think there needs to be a group tasked with taking care of those people that are leaving who don't care about the other pressures that someone else has to care about. So maybe that's already happening, but that would be my advice.
Thank you for your question. It's already happening. We have a group of employees that are trained for specifically for transition for those who are not reelected, and we have a group of employees that will assist members that have been assisting members in the past election for those who are new members and they want to have the orientation. So this is happening, and also we're very mindful that these two groups are different. So we're trying to make efforts so that these two groups do not necessarily interact. So we're being very mindful of that reality.
Patrice?
Yeah, and just in terms of your first comment, in terms of informing MPs now of the various programs that exist, it's actually in the plan that our Source Plus team members are going to go through all offices to inform them of the various resources available. So thank you for the suggestion. In terms of the communication, I've just been informed that it's 30 days that they're kept the phone numbers and the email, but we'll review that and we'll also look at the transferability of the phone, the cell phone number, if that, because we do understand that these devices.
Okay. And now the real Madame Jager.
Just to build off of that, I agree with prior to the dissolution of Parliament being able to share information. I think it's also important that we perhaps request like a next of kin or somebody else, because as somebody who got to see a colleague who did not get elected again, it was quite isolating as well. So I think people oftentimes contact their member of parliament because of the position more so than the individual, and depending on the time that's served here, we get to learn quickly who your friends are and who they're not. So I would agree with that. I do believe that the two transition teams, whether incoming or outgoing, should have some communication so that when it comes to pressures of vacating an office and so forth, to understand the reality of the individual. I think if we're bringing compassion into the system, that it's important that there be some communication to know who's in, who's out kind of thing, and how do we perhaps cater it a little bit more. So I hope you have the resources, looking at the fact that the number of members of parliament have increased to 338. What I would suggest on the emails front, if I can provide feedback, would be as when you graduate from post-secondary, you have an email that's part of your post-secondary institution, and then you become an alumni. And so I think as an alumnus, we could actually have a way of transitioning it, because I do think we have to be mindful of a role of a member of parliament versus someone who is no longer a member of parliament, and to have respect and regard for the institution. I think it can be quite a seamless process to provide someone an email address and transition them there, that it does get forwarded on. I know when I graduated from the University of Waterloo, my UWaterloo account automatically got moved into an alumni account, and my emails continued, and it was quite a seamless transition. So I have confidence in Stefan and his team to be able to do that. Thank you.
Remember when I graduated? What email? What's email? Monsieur Parent, quelque chose en réponse? No? Mr. Holland.
Just briefly, one other thing that, and I'll raise this to the Association of Former Parliamentarians, but what happens when somebody loses is it's only somebody who's lost can really understand what that process is and what it means. And I think that it would be very helpful if in a volunteer capacity, and I'm sure it could be arranged, there was some sort of proactive reach out after a certain period of time from former parliamentarians to connect with people who've lost, to talk about their experience, to talk about how they were able to successfully navigate that. And if you were to work with them to sort of formalize that process, because I do think it's a very, very unique experience. And, you know, for me, having contact with people who had lost and navigated that was enormously helpful. And I didn't really find anybody else quite understood what I was navigating and going through. So I think some sort of formalization of that would be important. I think that as those of us that remain after these events, and I've gone through many events where I've lost a lot of colleagues and stayed, you know, the madness of the job continues, and we're obviously continue to be pulled in our ridings and here. And so to carve out that extra time to reach out to colleagues is incredibly difficult. So the former parliamentarians, I think, would be the right group. And I think instead of just getting, because you get a letter like welcome to former parliamentarians, a lot of people don't really want to be in that group. It's not an exciting email to get or a letter to get. So I think, you know, reaching out differently, I think, would benefit them as an organization, but would really benefit members as well.
we'll reach out to the association.
Nice. Madame Chager.
When I did make the point about the next of kin, only reason I ask is sometimes the individual perhaps does not recognize that they do require some assistance and are perhaps isolated and so forth. So just to have a check-in with someone else, and that's an experience that I was able to recall, was the people around them felt the individual was also isolated, but to maybe be able to check in to make sure the family's okay or whatever.
So having in mind all those suggestions for further for the administration to further consider, are the recommendations as they're stated does the board wish to adopt these recommendations with a view to having other things looked at in the future? Is that the wish of members? Yes, it is. Agreed. Agreed. I think Mr. Strahl is smiling, so I take it he agrees too. Good, very good. Maintenant, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to number 5, occupying, managing, and vacating constituency offices. Our presenters are Daniel Paquette, Chief Financial Officer Philippe Dufresne, Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel, and José Fernandez, Deputy Chief Financial Officer. Mr. Paquette.
So I'm here today to seek the board's approval on policy changes that we hope continue to contribute to the support members in operating their constituency offices. Our consultations with the members indicated that some current policies are unclear to them and they could be more effective in providing that necessary support and manage their constituency offices. During our consultations, members expressed the need for increased support in the vacating, moving, occupying, and managing their constituency offices. Specifically, with these proposals and proposed policy changes, we aim to increase flexibility for members who are moving offices, ensure a smooth transition for office moves at the time of an election, clarify constituency office related policies, and provide tools and support in the preparation of their office leases. Donc, après avoir examiné tous les renseignements que nous avons compilés,
After having looked at all the information, the House Administration proposed the following changes regarding constituency offices.
time for newly elected members to make decisions around their office locations. Members do feel pressured to select a new office very quickly after an election and find that the current 4-month window for deciding where their office is going to be is not enough time to find that suitable office. We propose extending the period of centrally paid moves to one for the following the election to 1 full year to provide that additional flexibility. Our second proposal is to align the winding up period of both the parliamentary and constituency offices to 21 days. En s'appuyant sur les décisions précédentes du Bureau concernant l'attribution
Based on the board's previous decisions on constituency office leases and the recent decision of the board to allow members to keep their staff up to 14 days after the general election, there's less time and energy required on the part of the member now to wind up and vacate their offices after a general election. So based on those changes, members who are not re-elected would have up to 21 calendar days following the date of either their resignation or the general elections to vacate their offices.
additional support to members. Members are encouraged to choose an existing office space that is already set up as an office and to be used for that purpose. We propose to assist members in choosing a suitable office location by listing elements that would present what an existing office should contain, such as a reception area, security measures, and network capabilities. To further help members choose that suitable location, we also encourage members to use the use of a professional appraiser. This is a flat fee service that would provide an estimate of an office space and their market value and evaluate if it's compliant with the necessary office elements previously mentioned. Additionally, some office spaces chosen may require extensive renovation, creating long-term pressures on the member's budget. We propose that priority be initiated before initiating the renovations. The member do require to negotiate with their landlord and see whether these kinds of renovations really should be part of leasehold improvements, which are typically paid for by the landlord. Although there are renovation expenses that are not covered by the landlord, and these would be charged to the member's office budget in the fiscal in which they are incurred. This would reduce the long-term pressure for the budget on the member's budget. We are also proposing amending the timelines for completing renovations. Étant donné que les députés peuvent actuellement entreprendre des
Given that members can currently undertake renovations at any point in time, there can be situations that arrive where a member might have started renovations just before a general election, and then if they're not re-elected, the return on the investment is not particularly beneficial. So our proposal is to limit the completion of renovation work at the latest 3 years after the date of an general election or 12 months before the lease expires, and that would protect members against too great a commitment of resources.
members additional mandatory and recommended clauses for inclusion in their constituency office leases. The proposed clauses allow members to terminate their constituency office lease in the case of a landlord wrongdoing. They will allow the House administration to be notified of any changes to leases which will allow support to members in managing their lease and ensure constituency office meets newly accessible and occupational health and safety standards. Both the members and the House of Commons will benefit from the additional protection these clauses will afford. Members are encouraged who encounter difficulties including these necessary clauses in a given lease will need to consult the Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel for further guidance. Monsieur le Président, this concludes my presentation on this topic, and we're ready to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Strahl and
Just
Mr.
quickly,
Julian.
I guess I recognize that the three-year guideline works very well in a majority parliament situation. Obviously, more challenging in a minority. So I guess then that would fall back to the 12-month. I'm not familiar. Both of the times I've been elected, it's been in a majority setting, but I know that there are challenges, I'm sure, with signing leases with landlords for an indeterminate period of time, really. I guess I'm a little confused, though, about members are being told pick an existing space, but then that they can have leasehold improvements built into the lease and renovation costs assigned to their budget. So to me, those all sound contradictory. If you want people to, like, is that just encouraging people, or will the bylaws, will the policy actually prevent it in some cases where someone might be going into for instance, a brand new building with, build to suit, lease incentives, all the rest of it. I'm just unclear how you described it there. It seemed like there were 3 or 4 different options, but the first thing that is said is please choose something that's already built.
Well, one of the objectives we're trying to help here is provide guidance to members so that they're up and running as soon as possible. So clearly, if you are not going to be assuming the existing office that is already there, the ability to find something that is going to be ready for you to move in quickly is finding something that is already an office space and has the basic elements that you need, and just minor renovations could be needed to make it fit to your functionality. So that's kind of the first step we're hoping that members will do, and then get them operational as quickly as possible. After that, clearly it's not always possible, and depending on the scenarios and the constituency, and finding those offices. So the ability to do renovations is there. We want to make sure that they're reasonable. We've had situations where members have had to incur significant renovations and are paying those over the term of the Parliament, and it does tax their office budgets, and then they're limited on being able to do other things. So we're asking, the guidance will be to come and talk to us so that we can assist them in these, and we have created some additional capacity within my team to be able to provide that support, and they're experts in this field to help you along in making sure that we do find the right office with you and that it's up and running quickly.
I think what you're telling us is that this question about whether they use an existing space or a new space is where you're going to provide more suggestion than direction. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Julian.
Merci beaucoup. Merci pour la présentation.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions, and then perhaps I'll have comments depending on what you give me as an answer. So if I've understood correctly, you said that it was a problem where members were undertaking renovations just before an election. And what it meant was that it increased also the cost of their lease for following months. I just want to know if that really was a problem. Were there members actually undertaking renovations just before an election? And the second question is about the 21 calendar days. We were just talking about what happens with a member who's defeated. So they have to box up everything they've done. Perhaps sometimes that's 5 or 10 years worth of work. And the same applies to constituency offices. If I've understood correctly, staff have 14 days, but MPs have 21 days to wind all that up. So is that correct to say that those MPs who are leaving have 21 days and the employees have 14? Well, to your first question, under the policy, if they're going to undertake any significant renovations, they should come and see us. So there have been members who have requested to undertake renovations approaching an election year, and we've worked with them. And then they've, changed their mind, or there have been times as well where renovations started at the beginning of their mandate, but it did put their budget under a certain amount of pressure. So we've tried to work with members, and that's why we want a guide and tools to support them. What we want to do basically is to be able to avoid these situations and have a good management of funds. Now, in terms of the 21 days, this sort of strikes a balance. There's 17 days under the current policy for constituency offices and 30 days. Rather, 17 in Ottawa and 30 in the constituency. So we wanted our MPs to be fully supported during their transition and to have access to their staff for 14 days. So what it does is allow them to have a more stable period of time over those 21 days for the transition. Now, the constituency office remains open, and so the newly elected member has to be able to move into that office as quickly as possible. So what we're trying to do is basically strike a balance between the difficult situation of the defeated MP, but the newly elected MP who wants to be able to move in. And that 21 days seems to be acceptable for the majority. Thank you. Thank you for your answers. So it's sort of a notice, basically, for everyone. And I absolutely agree. Unless you have a very difficult situation like a flood, let's say, there's no real reason to be renovating offices at the last minute. So I think it's a good policy. I support it. But this 21 days, I think it's practical. However, if the MP has staff who can help them, then perhaps it works. You have 14 days with your staff, but only 21 days to leave. What if you want that staff to be able to help you? I mean, we've been talking about all the other aspects and all the other factors that MPs are experiencing. It seems to me that it would be good to be able to keep some staff or a staff to be able to complete that work within the 21 days. I think that would help with the transition. And it would help to make sure that that work is actually really done and wrapped up. And then the newly elected MP and staff can move in, as Mr. Strahl was talking about earlier. Yeah, I understand. The 14 days is something that members thought was appropriate. Now, if you feel there's a need, we're here to help you. Perhaps that 14 days could be adjusted to better align with the circumstances.
One of the things the board has decided not that long ago was that a defeated member would have the benefit of one employee paid for 14 days afterwards to assist with that process. So that's just an element that needs to be kept in mind, that's all. It might be of some interest. But I'm not suggesting that your point isn't well taken, by the way.
Well, we're making the period shorter from 30 to 21, right? And so I'm just suggesting if we're shortening the period, and I think there are very good and solid reasons for that. We're ending up now in a situation where that newly defeated member who is struggling with a whole range of things is also endeavoring to meet that new deadline, but without the new resources, or at least a few more days' resources from an employee that can help them and assist them in doing that. And I think if what we are all seeking is a smooth transition, that seems to me to be a bit of a weakness in the proposal. Everything else I absolutely support, but if we're moving the dates closer, I think it makes sense to allow that person to have somebody who can assist them in achieving that deadline.
But I do want to make it clear that it's an important point that before, previously, members couldn't pay a staff member afterwards, and now they can. I didn't clarify that before. That's a significant point. But if members have if other members have a feeling on this, a view on this, that they want to change something, I'm open to hearing their arguments, of course. Madam Bergen. Ms. Bergen.
Yeah, we may need to come back to it. I'm not sure where we are with the bells. 15.
To close the meeting, but maybe we can, to suspend the meeting, but on this item, with the thought we can come back and discuss this further. Do members wish to approve the recommendations as they are and come back and have further discussions later on this matter, or hold off on approving them?
I think, because I do have some issues around the whole 21 days in relation to what our previous discussion around members who lost their riding. So I think we should put this on hold and come back.
Okay.
On that point, though, if I could very quickly, we'll perhaps we can converse immediately before the vote, and hopefully we can come to some sort of consensus on that point. And if we do come back for 10 minutes, then perhaps we can clear up this item before we come to the next meeting.
Wait, Mr. Strahl?
I would suggest that we do come back after the vote, but that we immediately proceed to matter number 10, which is an in-camera portion, because I believe it's a time-sensitive matter. So if
So you'd want to suspend this issue until another meeting of the board? That's fine.
Yeah.
Is that agreed to everyone to come back with number 10? And we'll come back.
We just canvass if we have consensus, because if we have consensus, then we can clear this item and go, because
Why don't
we'll
we come
talk.
back to it?
We'll come back and we'll make that decision right after.
Very good. We'll suspend and we'll see you after the vote. Meeting suspended. back to order. How do you end suspension? What do you call that? Left the suspension.
Resumed.
Resumed, that, of course, that's it. I gather we're going to go back to number 5. I think there's agreement to approve the recommendations in number 5. Is that correct? So it's agreed.
And we'll move in camera.
And now we'll have to move in camera, so we'll take a moment to do that because we have to go in to do some things that have to be discussed in camera.